The plague was never just a single event. It was a shadow that lingered above the city, patient and merciless, returning again and again as if mocking every attempt to escape it. People would whisper prayers, burn herbs in the streets, or ring church bells in desperation, but none of it mattered. The true cause was not divine punishment or some passing curse from the heavens. It was the city itself, the very structure of daily life, the way people lived pressed together among filth, the way water was drawn, food was stored, and animals roamed free, created a breeding ground where death could flourish. You could seal your doors, but the stench would seep through the cracks. You could try to move away, but the fleas clung to your clothes and the rats followed the food. There was no wall high enough to keep it out. For the ordinary family, the inevitability of plague was a lesson learned in childhood. Imagine a child no older than 8, watching from the doorway as a neighbor is carried past on a crude wooden board, covered only by a stained cloth. The child's mother whispers for them to look away, yet the sight remains etched forever. The disease did not wait for your permission, and the city never gave you safety. It was understood, deep down, that life was a gamble with invisible dice, rolled in the alleys and courtyards where people gathered. Every outbreak left behind a trail of memories. Survivors remembered the silence after the bells stopped ringing, the eerie emptiness when half of a street had perished. But silence was not safety. It was only an intermission, like the pause between the strike of one hammer and the next. Those who dared to believe the horror was gone soon learned that it always returned. People buried their dead, washed the blood from the streets with buckets of water, and prayed that this time it would be different. But the very next season, the same rats scurried over the cobblestones, the same fleas bit into human skin, and the same cycle of misery began again. The truth is that medieval and early modern cities were perfect traps. Houses were built tightly, with no regard for airflow or light. Wastewater was tossed casually from windows, splattering onto the streets where children played barefoot. Animals, pigs, goats, chickens, were not kept far from people, but often lived under the same roof. Food was sold in open markets without protection from flies, and the carcasses of dead horses, too heavy to move, were left to rot by the roadside. No matter where you turned, you stepped into a world layered with infection. This was not negligence, it was survival. People had no other way, and so the inevitability of plague was not a mystery, it was a certainty. People did not ask if death would come, but when. Entire communities lived with this awareness carved into their bones. In one account from a German city in the 16th century, a merchant wrote of how he woke each morning wondering whether he would see the sun set, not because of war or crime, but because a single cough from a neighbor might carry his doom. That was daily life. That was the normal. There were moments of false hope. City leaders occasionally tried desperate measures, burning piles of herbs in the streets, ordering citizens to carry nosegays of flowers to ward off the bad air, or even ringing massive church bells to cleanse the heavens with their sound. But while people clung to rituals, the real killers were multiplying in the shadows. A flea did not care about incense. A rat could not be frightened by a bell. And when the sickness came again, people realized that all their efforts were like trying to hold back the tide with their bare hands. The psychological toll was as heavy as the physical. Imagine the fear of lying down at night, listening to the scratching in the walls, knowing that rats were only inches away. Imagine waking up to find a family member with a swollen lump on their neck, already shivering with fever. People lived on the edge of panic, clinging to faith because logic gave them no comfort. The city itself felt alive, like a predator waiting for the next chance to strike. What made this worse was the realization that there was nowhere else to go. Villages outside the cities were hardly better. Travelers carried the disease in their clothing, spreading it to farms and inns. Refugees who fled outbreaks often brought the sickness with them. A mother might escape with her children into the countryside, only to find that the very act of running carried death to those she met along the road. The inevitability of plague was written into the very movement of people, into the dust of the streets and the silence of the wells. And yet, people adapted. They learned to live in the shadow of death, to celebrate small joys even as they buried their neighbors. Markets reopened, laughter returned to taverns, weddings were held even when the smell of graves lingered nearby. The resilience was astonishing, but it was also tragic, because it meant that the cycle was accepted. People knew, deep down, that no celebration could last, that behind the laughter there was always the whisper of footsteps returning, the reminder that the plague never truly left. That is what made these cities so terrifying. Not the occasional outbreak, but the knowledge that it was part of the fabric of life itself. The inevitability was not just medical, not just biological, but cultural. People grew up with it, raised families under it, and died with the certainty that another wave would come. The city was a stage, and the plague was the actor who never left the play. And as the sun set behind the rooftops, the smell of decay rising once again, people wondered which part of their world would collapse next. A horse collapsing in the middle of a busy street was not an unusual sight in the cities of the past. These animals were the lifeblood of urban life, pulling carts, carrying goods, and transporting people through narrow, uneven roads. But when one of them died, the story did not end with a quiet removal or respectful burial. More often than not, the carcass was left where it fell, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. A dead horse could weigh more than half a ton, and few had the means or the will to drag it away. So it stayed, bloating in the sun, a grotesque reminder that the city was not built to manage death. The same was true for dogs, cats, goats, and pigs. Animals were everywhere in urban centers, and they died everywhere too. A stray dog, struck down by disease, might lie by the side of a marketplace, its body swelling and stiffening while people simply stepped around it. A pig, fattened for slaughter but collapsing before its time, could be abandoned in an alley, its smell carrying for blocks. The logic was cold but practical. When death came, life moved on. Those who passed by often pinched their noses or muttered a prayer, but they rarely intervened. Removing these corpses was costly, and in cities where survival itself was already precarious, few were willing to take on the task. The consequences of this neglect were unavoidable. A decomposing body attracted swarms of flies, and flies did not stay in one place. They landed on the meat sold in stalls, on the bread displayed openly in baskets, and on the lips of children too young to swat them away. Maggots wriggled from open wounds of carcasses, spilling into the streets, a grotesque river of larvae crawling toward gutters already clogged with waste. To modern eyes, it seems unimaginable that people could live with such horrors. But for them, it was simply the backdrop of city life. The stench was part of the air they breathed, the buzzing of flies part of the daily soundtrack. This indifference came from a harsh reality. Urban populations had grown faster than their infrastructure, and the burden of managing waste, whether human or animal, was overwhelming. Authorities often ignored the problem, or at best, appointed poorly paid workers to drag carcasses to the outskirts, where they might be burned or dumped in pits. But these efforts were irregular and insufficient. Records from London in the 14th century describe complaints about horse carcasses left in Cheapside for so long that shopkeepers claimed they lost customers who could not bear the smell. In Paris, chroniclers wrote of entire streets rendered impassable because of the number of dead animals blocking them. Yet what is most haunting is how people became numb to it. Children played in the same alleys where corpses rotted. Housewives walked past them with baskets of vegetables, too focused on survival to pause. The dead became scenery, their presence so common that it barely drew attention. Only when the smell became unbearable, or when the body began to split apart under the pressure of gases, did someone finally complain. By then, the damage was done. Flies had multiplied, fleas had migrated, and rats had already feasted, and rats thrived on this abundance. A horse carcass was a banquet for colonies of rodents. Dozens could burrow into the body, gnawing at the flesh from within, their eyes glinting in the dark hollows of ribs and skull. The sight was enough to haunt anyone who stumbled upon it at night. But rats did not remain by the corpse. They scattered, carrying fleas into homes, shops, and taverns. In this way, the death of a single animal could ripple outward into dozens of human lives, each contact an invisible thread in the web of infection. One cannot overstate the psychological effect of these scenes. Imagine walking to church in your best clothes, only to pass by the bloated body of a mule, legs stiff in the air, tongue hanging grotesquely from its mouth. The smell clings to your hair, seeps into your garments, and follows you inside, where prayers are whispered beneath vaulted ceilings. Faith provided comfort, but no prayer could erase the reality outside. The sacred and the profane coexisted in suffocating closeness. Even when the bodies were removed, the memory lingered. Stories circulated of neighborhoods cursed by the presence of too many animal deaths. Some believed that spirits clung to the places where carcasses had decayed, infecting not just the air but the very soul of the street. These beliefs were not entirely irrational, for wherever animals rotted, disease followed. Typhus, dysentery, and plague found fertile ground in the neighborhoods where corpses and waste were abandoned. Over time, certain professions emerged around this grim necessity. Knackers and bone collectors made their living by scavenging carcasses, stripping away usable hides, fat, and bones, leaving behind scraps too rancid to profit from. But their work was despised. They were seen as unclean, shunned from polite society, forced to live at the fringes. And yet, without them, the cities would have drowned even faster in decay. The irony was bitter. Those who kept the streets livable were treated as pariahs. The reality of dead animals in the streets was not just a detail of urban life. It was a central part of the ecosystem of death. It fed rats, it nurtured flies, it poisoned water, and it deadened the human spirit. To live among it was to accept that life and death were intertwined at every step, that the smell of rotting flesh was as common as the ringing of a church bell. And in that acceptance, a new fear grew, because if the city tolerated this, then what chance did anyone have against the smaller creatures, the ones unseen, that carried death in their tiny legs and invisible bites? They were almost invisible, but they ruled the fate of entire cities. Fleas, no larger than the head of a pin, lived in the shadows of daily life, hidden in the thick fur of rats, in straw mattresses, and in the folds of clothing. People never noticed them until it was too late. A tiny bite, barely more than an inch at first, could carry the weight of 1,000 deaths. For the people of those centuries, the real enemy was not the plague itself, but the army of insects that carried it silently from one body to the next. The relationship between fleas and rats was a deadly partnership. Rats thrived in every corner of the city, in sewers, behind taverns, under floorboards, and even inside food storage. They bred quickly, their numbers doubling in weeks, and wherever they went, the fleas followed. When a rat died, its fleas leapt off in search of new hosts, and the closest warm body was often human. The transfer was instant and unstoppable. Within hours, an entire family might carry the same parasites that had fed on diseased rodents the night before. Fleas were relentless travelers. They could hitch a ride on the hem of a cloak, on the wool of a shepherd's coat, or in the straw stuffed into shoes. Soldiers brought them from the battlefield back to towns. Merchants carried them across borders with their goods, and pilgrims unknowingly spread them along holy routes. Every great movement of people in the medieval world was shadowed by these tiny passengers. While kings planned wars and priests led processions, fleas rode quietly in the fabric of society, more effective than any army, more persuasive than any sermon. Their bite was deceptively simple. Most ignored the first signs, a small red mark, a persistent itch, but beneath the skin, a chain of destruction began. The flea regurgitated bacteria into the bloodstream, and within days the victim might develop fever, chills, and the dreaded swelling of lymph nodes, the buboes that gave the Black Death its name. Entire households could be infected by a single flea, passed from body to body in the dark of night. What terrified people most was the randomness. One child might be spared, while his mother died in agony. A merchant might live, while his apprentice perished. To the human eye, it seemed like chaos, but the fleas followed their own ruthless logic. Cities were especially vulnerable. In crowded neighborhoods, families shared single rooms, their beds stuffed with straw that teemed with insects. Washing clothes was a rare luxury, and bathing was often avoided out of superstition. In such conditions, fleas multiplied unchecked, biting dozens of people in a single evening. Chroniclers describe households where every member scratched themselves raw, but no one understood that the scratching was the first sign of disaster. People believed in curses, in poisoned air, or in sins bringing punishment. No one imagined that the killers were crawling under their very blankets. What is chilling is how ordinary fleas seemed until disaster struck. Children played with rats, stroking their fur without fear, never realizing they were stroking the vehicles of their own destruction. Adults tolerated flea bites the way we tolerate mosquito bites today, thinking of them as nuisances rather than threats. It was this blindness that gave the insects power. The plague spread most effectively not because of its lethality, but because of the way people underestimated the creature that carried it. The psychological scars were deep. Survivors of outbreaks often spoke of paranoia afterward. Some refused to sit on straw benches again, convinced they were crawling with invisible enemies. Others avoided contact with animals entirely, fearing that even a friendly cat could harbor fleas. The horror of the plague was not just in the mass graves or the swollen corpses. It was in the knowledge that something so small, so ordinary, could overturn the fate of kingdoms. Even attempts to fight back were doomed. People tried to smoke fleas out of their homes with herbs, to wash themselves in vinegar, or to rub garlic on their skin as protection. But the fleas returned, hopping from neighbor to neighbor, from corpse to coffin to child. Rats, meanwhile, thrived in the abundance of food and filth, ensuring that their companions never lacked new opportunities. It was a perfect system, an alliance between rodent and insect that humanity had no tools to break. This invisible war shaped every corner of urban life. A flea did not care if its victim was rich or poor, priest or beggar. A bishop in his robes was as vulnerable as a peasant in rags. Palaces and hovels alike became infested, erasing the boundaries of class. This equality of suffering was one of the most terrifying aspects of the plague. It planted seeds of resentment in society. People wondered why their leaders, who lived in wealth, could not protect themselves or their citizens. Authority was shaken, not by swords or rebellions, but by the silent march of insects. As stories spread, people began to see rats differently. Once tolerated as scavengers, they became symbols of death. Chroniclers wrote of villagers setting entire barns on fire to drive them out, though this often spread the infestation further. But even when rats were feared, fleas remained invisible. They had no name, no recognition. People cursed the rats, but never understood the true culprit. And while they cursed, the cycle continued. Every buzzing marketplace, every silent monastery, every crowded tavern hid this hidden menace. People lived in constant exposure, though most never realized it until fever gripped their bodies. And if the fleas thrived in homes, they thrived even more in the public spaces that sustained city life, where food was sold, water was drawn, and waste piled higher than anyone could manage. It was there, among the stinking pits and festering streets, that their reach grew unstoppable. The water that promised life often carried death instead. In the heart of every city stood a communal well, a gathering place where women filled their buckets, children splashed their hands, and neighbors exchanged gossip. On the surface, it seemed like a symbol of survival, but beneath the stones, it was a silent trap. Wells were shallow, often dug too close to latrines, cesspits, or open drains. Human waste seeped invisibly through the soil, mixing with the very water people trusted to keep them alive. Each gulp was a gamble, each ladle drawn from the bucket, a risk that could set fever coursing through the body by nightfall. The contamination was not limited to human waste. Dead animals discarded nearby, piles of rotting garbage, even the blood washed from butchers' stalls. All of it could seep into the groundwater. Medieval cities had no understanding of bacteria, no concept of microorganisms, so they blamed bad air or divine wrath when entire households fell ill after drinking from the same well. The truth was much crueler. Their own daily habits were poisoning them, and they had no means of escape. In times of scarcity, desperation only worsened the danger. When a well turned foul, the water became cloudy or carried a foul taste, but people still drank it. Boiling was costly, requiring precious firewood that most families saved for cooking and warmth. Filtering was attempted with cloth, but a rag could not remove invisible killers. Thirst was stronger than caution, and so mouths pressed against ladles even when the smell of rot clung to the surface. Mothers offered the same water to their children, watching helplessly as sickness spread through the home days later. Historical records are filled with accounts of outbreaks tied to wells. In the 17th century, a cholera-like sickness ravaged an Italian town after bodies from a plague pit were buried too close to the community water source. In London, observers complained that butchers washed entrails into the Thames, from which wells drew their supply. And in German chronicles, villagers begged for rain not simply to water their crops, but to dilute the poisoned wells that were turning their stomachs and bowels into battlegrounds. Each case was a grim reminder that water, the most essential element of life, had become an accomplice of death. The rituals surrounding water were also telling. People sometimes threw herbs, coins, or even small sacrifices into wells, hoping to appease whatever spirits they believed guarded the flow. Priests blessed the water with holy rites. Yet the sickness returned again and again. Faith gave them comfort, but it did not change the taste of decay that lingered on their tongues. The illusion of safety was shattered every time another child coughed up blood, or an elder collapsed from sudden cramps. Wells were sacred in imagination, but in reality they were cesspools, quietly gathering the filth of the city above. Consider the daily routine of a city dweller. At dawn they carried buckets to the well, jostling with others in line, the rope creaking as the bucket plunged into the dark shaft. Hands gripped the wet rope, transferring fleas and dirt from one person to another. Children dipped their fingers into the bucket, laughing, unaware that the water already carried an invisible cargo of disease. By midday, that same water was poured into soups, mixed with beer, or given to livestock. By night, fevers rose, bowels loosened, and another family marked their door with ash, signaling illness inside. What made this tragedy worse was the absolute lack of alternatives. Streams near cities were choked with waste as people used them to wash clothes, dump refuse, and empty chamber pots. Rainwater was collected, but only in small amounts, and it quickly became stale in storage. Wells, despite their dangers, remained the only reliable source, which meant that people had no choice but to return to them day after day, even as rumors spread of neighbors struck down after drinking the same supply. Fear lingered, but thirst silenced doubt. The contamination of water also shaped social behavior. Wealthier households sometimes bought wine or beer as substitutes, believing them safer. But for the poor, water was the only option. This created a cruel divide. Those with means could avoid the worst, while the majority suffered. It bred resentment, whispered curses, and a sense that God himself favored the rich. The bitterness of inequality mixed with the bitterness of foul water, creating wounds that went far beyond the body. And yet, even those with substitutes were not safe. Beer was often brewed with contaminated water, its slight fermentation masking but not erasing the danger. The poor man who drank from the well and the merchant who raised his cup in a tavern often shared the same fate. In this way, the poisoned wells united the city in suffering, cutting across class and privilege. No one was untouchable. It is haunting to imagine that a single drop of water could alter the fate of an entire community. A poisoned well could empty a street, silence a marketplace, or wipe out a generation of children. People clung to life by drinking, yet each sip brought them closer to death. And while water carried its silent curse, the city above only added to its misery. Because where water failed, the mountains of garbage and refuse piled high in every street ensured that sickness found new ways to thrive. The streets of a medieval city were never silent. They buzzed with the sound of voices bargaining, the clatter of carts, and the cries of hawkers selling their goods. But beneath this life and movement, there was always another sound, the low, steady hum of flies circling above stalls where meat hung exposed to the sun. Markets were the beating heart of the city, places where people found not only food, but also community. And yet, They were also places where death waited in plain sight, hidden behind the smell of spices and the chatter of merchants. Meat was at the center of these markets, laid out in slabs on rough wooden tables, dripping blood into grooves that had soaked the same substance day after day. There was no refrigeration, no ice, no preservation beyond salt, and salt was expensive. Meat slaughtered in the morning was often still sold in the evening, its edges darkened, its smell growing stronger. By the second day, it was already attracting flies in clouds, but desperate buyers still took it home, hoping to cut away the worst parts. Hunger made people overlook the stench, because even spoiled meat seemed better than an empty stomach. The butchers themselves worked in conditions that only worsened the problem. Animals were slaughtered on site, their entrails thrown into buckets or directly onto the ground. Blood pooled and ran into gutters, mixing with human waste and the refuse of the city. The smell of iron hung in the air, thick and metallic, clinging to clothes, hair, and skin. Butchers were often despised, seen as unclean by other trades, yet they were indispensable. Everyone needed them, even as everyone cursed them. Their stalls were both a source of life and a source of disease. Flies were more than a nuisance here, they were carriers, landing on carcasses, then on bread, then on fruit. They spread contamination with every movement of their tiny legs. Chroniclers described markets where meat seemed alive with maggots, where customers turned their heads to avoid the sight but still handed over coins. Some cities tried to regulate the trade, ordering that meat be inspected or sold only at certain times of day. But the rules were rarely enforced, and in poorer districts they were ignored altogether. The result was an endless cycle of rotting flesh feeding both bodies and the plagues that consumed them. The problem extended beyond the meat itself. The markets were crowded, and in their chaos, food was dropped, trampled, and picked up again to be resold. Water used to wash stalls quickly became filthy, but merchants splashed it on their tables anyway, spreading more bacteria with each stroke. Dogs roamed freely, snatching scraps from under the counters, while cats clawed at hanging cuts of pork or beef. Children played barefoot near piles of discarded bones, their hands sticky with juices they later wiped on their mouths. The boundaries between human life and decay were blurred in every corner. What makes this even more haunting is the cultural acceptance of it all. To the people of those times, the smells and sights of the market were not shocking. They were normal. The stench of meat turning sour was part of the air, as ordinary as the sound of church bells. To refuse spoiled food was to risk starvation, and so families ate it, seasoned heavily with garlic, vinegar, or herbs, in the hope of masking the taste. Recipes from the era often included strong spices, not simply for flavor, but as a desperate attempt to cover the rot. There are chilling anecdotes preserved in city records. In Paris, one inspector noted that entire carcasses of diseased animals were sold to the poor at half price, even when the flesh was visibly green. In Florence, complaints were made about butchers who dipped meat in wine to hide the smell of rot. And in London, a chronicler described markets where the blood ran so thick that it stained the feet of passers-by, soaking into their shoes. These stories reveal a world where survival demanded a tolerance for corruption of both food and body. But the markets were more than just centers of commerce, they were engines of contagion. People gathered shoulder to shoulder, coughing, sneezing, and shouting above the noise. Rats scurried underfoot, feeding on discarded scraps, their fleas jumping effortlessly onto human legs. Every transaction, every touch of a coin, every shared sip of watered wine was a potential chain in the spread of disease. The market was a theater where hunger and death played side by side, and everyone was an actor in the performance. And yet, despite all this, markets thrived. They had to. They were the only place where city dwellers could reliably find sustenance. The poor could not afford to raise their own animals, and gardens within city walls were rare and limited. So they came again and again to the same foul-smelling stalls, carrying home meat that would sicken them, all the while believing it was nourishment. It was a cruel paradox. The very place that gave them life also cut it short. The resilience of people in this environment is both inspiring and tragic. They adapted, they endured, and they found ways to continue their lives amid conditions that to us seem unbearable. But every purchase carried a shadow, every mouthful a risk. And when night fell, the market stalls were empty, the smell lingered in the air, clinging to the stones of the city. It reminded everyone that rot was not just confined to the stalls, but seeped into the very fabric of the streets, into the alleys, the homes, and the places where waste piled higher than anyone could bear. The smell was the first thing you noticed when entering a medieval city. It clung to your clothes, filled your nostrils, and settled deep into your memory. Travelers often wrote that long after they had left the city walls, the odor still seemed to follow them, as though the streets themselves had left a mark on their very skin. It was not one smell, but a combination of many: rotting food, human waste, animal carcasses, stagnant water, smoke, and sweat. Together, they created a suffocating presence that could never truly be escaped. The streets were narrow, often only wide enough for 2 carts to pass. The tall wooden houses on either side trapped the stench like a tunnel. Rainwater mixed with garbage to form foul streams that trickled down the cobblestones. On warm days, the air became thick, almost chewable, as the heat amplified every odor. In winter, the cold slowed decay but never erased it. The smell was permanent, part of the very identity of the city, and people accepted it the way we accept the sound of traffic today. Unpleasant, but inescapable. For the inhabitants, the odor was more than an inconvenience. It was a constant reminder of mortality. Physicians of the time believed in miasma, the theory that bad air itself carried disease. People stuffed herbs into their noses, carried pouches of lavender or rosemary, and walked with cloths soaked in vinegar pressed to their faces. Some wore elaborate masks filled with perfumes, hoping to block the invisible poisons. These rituals show how deeply people feared the smell, equating it directly with death. To breathe foul air was to gamble with your life. Yet daily survival forced everyone to confront it. Imagine a mother sending her child to the market, knowing he would have to pass by open gutters where human waste floated past like a black river, or a craftsman returning from work, pushing his way through crowds near a butcher's stall, his shoes soaking in the mixture of blood and rainwater that never fully washed away. Each inhalation carried the fear that the air itself was a weapon, and yet no one could refuse to breathe. Accounts from travelers paint a vivid picture. An Italian merchant visiting Paris in the 14th century complained that the smell of the Seine near the markets made him vomit. A monk in London described the stench around Cheapside as so overwhelming that he could not pray without gagging. And in Nuremberg, chroniclers wrote that the air near the tannery quarter was considered unholy, a punishment to anyone who had to pass through. These descriptions remind us that while cities were centers of culture and trade, they were also overwhelming assaults on the senses. The psychological toll of the smell was immense. People came to associate certain streets or quarters with illness, even when they had no understanding of germs. A neighborhood that stank of rotting fish became a place to avoid, even if your hunger demanded otherwise. Superstitions grew, with residents believing that evil spirits lived in the foul air, clinging to walls and drifting into open windows. At night, when the air was still and heavy, fear grew worse. The smell seemed to thicken in the dark, pressing down on sleepers and reminding them that no one could truly escape it. And yet, the smell was not just a warning of disease, it was also an everyday companion. Children grew up in it, playing games in alleys where the odor of human waste was as familiar as the sound of laughter. Lovers whispered to each other in taverns where the scent of stale beer and unwashed bodies filled the air. Priests led processions through streets that reeked of sewage, their incense burning not just as a symbol of devotion, but as an attempt to mask the unbearable odor. The stench united every aspect of life, from the sacred to the profane. The attempts to fight it were often futile. City authorities ordered the streets to be washed, but the water only spread the filth more widely. They tried covering carcasses with lime, but the smell still seeped through. Fires were lit to cleanse the air, filling neighborhoods with smoke that mingled with the existing stench. None of it worked for long. By the following day, new waste had accumulated, new animals had died, and the smell returned as strong as ever. It was not a problem to be solved. It was the natural condition of urban life. Some people adapted by dulling their senses. Chroniclers mention residents who claim not to notice the stench after years of living in the same place. But even if the nose could grow numb, the body could not. The smell carried with it unseen dangers. Each whiff meant inhaling particles of decay, each breath an invitation for disease to settle. People might ignore the odor, but they could never ignore the sickness that followed. The haunting truth was that the smell became a symbol of inevitability. It told everyone, from the richest merchant to the poorest beggar, that the city itself was rotting from the inside out. You could light candles, you could pray, you could fill your home with herbs, but the stench would always find its way in. It seeped through doors and windows, through cracks in the walls into clothing and skin. It reminded every inhabitant that death was not just in the cemeteries or plague pits, it was in the very air they breathed. And if the smell was a constant companion during the day, it grew unbearable at night, when silence fell and the senses sharpened. Darkness magnified every odor, turning whispers of decay into suffocating waves. It was in those moments, when families huddled together in their homes, that the stench became more than just a nuisance. It became a fear, a premonition that behind the foulness of the air, something far worse was always waiting to emerge from the shadows of the city. Death in the city was never private. When sickness swept through households and bodies began to fall, the streets themselves became corridors of grief. There were no morgues, no organized services to handle the dead. Families were often left with no choice but to drag their loved ones outside, laying them on the doorstep or leaving them by the roadside, waiting for someone, anyone, to take them away. Corpses lined alleys, their limbs stiffening in unnatural positions, faces frozen in the last grimace of agony. And in the summer heat, decay set in with brutal speed. The smell of rot clung to entire neighborhoods, announcing death long before anyone saw it with their eyes. Funerals, when they happened, were hurried affairs. There was no time for elaborate rites when dozens or even hundreds were dying each week. Priests rushed from home to home, murmuring prayers over bodies piled together in carts. Graves were dug hastily, sometimes so shallow that dogs and rats unearthed the remains within days. In wealthier districts, families tried to preserve dignity by paying for quick burials in churchyards, but even those filled beyond capacity. Bones were shifted, older graves exhumed, and new coffins squeezed into whatever space remained. Death did not respect sacred ground. It spilled over it, drowning tradition under the weight of sheer numbers. The poorer classes suffered most. Without money for proper burials, their dead were carried to mass graves at the edge of the city. Pits were dug deep, wide enough to swallow hundreds of bodies, layer upon layer, each covered with lime to slow the stench but never truly erase it. Chroniclers describe the sound of carts creaking under the load of corpses, the thud of bodies falling into pits like sacks of grain. Families followed behind, weeping not only for the loss of life, but for the loss of dignity. To be buried nameless among strangers was considered a second death, an erasure of identity. The horror of abandoned bodies was compounded by fear. People believed that corpses themselves carried poison into the air, that the stench of decay could sicken the living. Neighbors sometimes refused to help remove the dead, leaving families trapped in their homes with the bodies of loved ones. There are chilling accounts of children left for days beside their dead parents, too weak or too frightened to call for help. Entire households could be found lifeless inside, the windows shuttered, the silence broken only when authorities forced the doors open and the bodies tumbled out. In some cities, death carts became a grim feature of daily life. Men tasked with collecting the dead would push or pull wagons through the streets, calling out for families to bring forth their corpses. Their cries were as familiar as the tolling of church bells. "Bring out your dead." At first, people rushed to comply, desperate to rid their homes of disease. But as outbreaks grew worse, even the collectors faltered. Many refused to enter houses, demanding that families drag the bodies to the doors themselves. Some even collapsed mid-route, infected by the very plague they sought to contain, their own bodies added to the load they once carried. What strikes us most today is how quickly death became ordinary. A corpse on the street was not always cause for alarm, merely another obstacle to step around. Children walked past them on their way to the well. Apprentices hurried by on errands. Merchants continued their trade as bodies lay slumped against walls nearby. The presence of death lost its shock, becoming another background feature of urban life. It was not that people were heartless, they were overwhelmed. When death came every day, there was no energy left for outrage. Yet, even in the midst of this, rituals survived. Mothers whispered final prayers over their children before abandoning them to the carts. Widows tied ribbons to their husbands' wrists, hoping they would be recognized in the pits. Some families marked their doors with chalk crosses, both as warnings to others and as pleas for clerics to come. These small gestures of love and desperation remind us that behind every statistic of death was a story, a human life struggling to cling to meaning in a world collapsing under plague. The abandonment of bodies also carried spiritual weight. People feared that improper burials trapped souls in limbo, condemned to wander the earth. Rumors spread of ghosts haunting plague pits, of restless spirits wailing at night near cemeteries overflowing with the dead. These beliefs added another layer of terror, for people felt that the plague not only destroyed the body but endangered the soul. It was not just physical death they faced, but eternal unrest. There is one chilling detail preserved in the writings of a Florentine notary during the Black Death. He described how, at the height of the epidemic, corpses lay in church pews for days because there were no hands left to carry them away. The holy space became indistinguishable from the streets outside, filled with the same stench of decay. Faith and filth intertwined, leaving people with the haunting sense that the sacred itself had been overwhelmed by death. The truth was inescapable. Death was not hidden, not softened, not private. It was public, relentless, and always in view. And if the presence of corpses scarred the eyes and the heart, it was the filth that surrounded them, the endless waste, the piles of refuse, the garbage rotting in the streets, that made survival itself a daily battle against disease. For even when the bodies were gone, the city's waste remained, feeding the rats, breeding the insects, and ensuring that the cycle of sickness never truly ended. Filth was the one element no city could ever escape. It clung to the stones of the streets, piled up in alleys, and filled the air with its presence. Waste was everywhere, human, animal, and industrial, and it flowed together in a chaotic tide that defined daily life. There was no organized system of disposal. Families emptied their chamber pots directly into the street, sending streams of urine and excrement trickling between cobblestones where children played and chickens pecked for scraps. Butchers tossed entrails into gutters, bakers swept burned crusts into piles, and tanners dumped foul chemicals into open ditches. The result was a city that lived constantly in its own refuse, suffocating under the weight of its own survival. Walking through such a place was an assault on the senses. A man heading to the marketplace would have to sidestep mounds of rotting vegetables, dead dogs stiff with rigor mortis, and pools of blackened water buzzing with flies. On hot summer days, the filth fermented. rising in waves of stench that could make travelers gag. Rain offered no relief. It only spread the waste more widely, turning streets into rivers of decay. Wooden clogs, once soaked, carried the smell home, where it lingered for days, infecting even private spaces. People tried to sweep the refuse aside, but without proper disposal, the piles simply reformed, higher and fouler each time. This mountain of waste was more than just an inconvenience. It was a breeding ground. Flies multiplied in droves, carrying disease from excrement to food stalls. Rats found endless feasts among discarded bones and spoiled grain, multiplying in the shadows of barns and basements. Vermin did not merely survive in this environment. They flourished, their numbers growing in direct proportion to the amount of garbage available. And as they flourished, so did the plagues they carried. Each scrap of rotten food left in the open, each pile of waste left to rot, was another invitation to infestation. There are records that paint chilling images of this filth. In 14th century London, city officials noted that butchers dumped so much blood and offal into the streets that nearby residents could not open their windows without retching. In Paris, chroniclers described carts overflowing with garbage left uncollected for weeks, spilling refuse across entire districts. In German towns, travelers often remarked that the smell of tanning pits mixed with human waste made entire quarters uninhabitable. These were not exaggerations, they were lived realities, repeated in every growing city across Europe. The psychological impact of such constant exposure cannot be overstated. People grew numb to the sight of filth, accepting it as normal. A child might step barefoot into a pile of dungs and think nothing of it. Housewives washed vegetables in water already tainted with sewage. Tavern-goers drank ale brewed in contaminated vats, shrugging off the sour taste. To them, this was simply the cost of city life. But beneath this acceptance lay fear. People whispered that sickness rose from the filth itself, that the air above waste carried invisible poisons. They were not wrong. Though they lacked the science to explain bacteria, they could feel its effects in every fever, every cough, every sudden death. Attempts to control the problem were often laughably inadequate. Some cities appointed nightmen to collect waste, but they worked sporadically, underpaid and overwhelmed. Others passed laws banning the dumping of refuse in certain areas, but enforcement was weak, and offenders simply moved their filth elsewhere. At times, garbage was burned in pits, filling the air with thick smoke that only added to the city's misery. Even when authorities tried to dig deeper ditches or expand dumping grounds, the growing population quickly outpaced the effort. The waste always returned heavier and more pungent, a tide that no shovel could stem. The worst part was how the waste connected to food and water. Markets were set up beside gutters, their stalls surrounded by the stench of rot. Wells stood near cesspits, their contents slowly poisoned by the seepage. Bread baked in the morning could be crawling with insects by evening, and the rats that thrived in the filth gnawed at grain stores, leaving droppings that spread contamination long before the food reached a buyer's table. In this way, the filth was not just underfoot, it invaded the very essentials of survival. One particularly haunting detail comes from accounts of plague outbreaks. When death carts collected corpses, they sometimes dumped them in the same pits where garbage was already piling up. Human remains mingled with animal carcasses, household waste, and industrial refuse, erasing the line between the sacred and the profane. Death became part of the garbage heap, indistinguishable from the other discarded elements of life. Families knew that their loved ones' bodies might rest forever among the city's waste, swallowed by a pit that stank of rot and despair. And yet, people lived. They ate, worked, married, and raised children in these conditions. They learned to block the smell with herbs stuffed into their clothing, to cover their faces with scarves, to accept the buzzing of flies as part of the city's soundtrack. But this acceptance came at a terrible cost, for in that very filth, in the buzzing of insects and the scratching of rats, lay the seeds of every epidemic. The waste was not only a burden to the senses, it was the foundation on which sickness built its empire. The omnipresence of garbage was a daily reminder that the city itself was fragile, a place constantly at risk of collapse under its own weight. Each pile of refuse, each clogged gutter, each rat scurrying over bones was a warning. And as the waste grew higher and the stench grew stronger, people knew deep down that worse horrors always followed, that filth was only the beginning, and what it attracted was far more terrifying than the garbage itself. Illness often seemed to appear without warning, as if conjured by the very air. One morning a family might wake to the sound of laughter, children playing in the courtyard, merchants setting up their stalls. By evening the same street could be silent, doors closed, a single cough inside signaling the beginning of a tragedy. To the people of those centuries, disease felt like a phantom. It struck without pattern, ignoring wealth, piety, or strength. You could be healthy at dawn and burning with fever by nightfall. No one could predict its arrival, and that uncertainty gnawed at the soul even more than the sickness itself. The truth was that these invisible illnesses were everywhere, carried in fleas, in water, in food, and in the very waste that lined the streets. But since people had no knowledge of microbes, they built explanations from what they could see and feel. The theory of miasma, bad air dominated thought. They believed the stench of decay itself seeped into the body, poisoning the blood. When someone fell ill after walking through a foul-smelling alley, the logic seemed undeniable. Priests described plagues as punishments from God, while common folk whispered about curses, witchcraft, or the evil eye. Fear of the unseen was more terrifying than fear of the tangible. Consider the suddenness of these outbreaks. A baker might collapse over his oven, the smell of bread mixing with the stench of his sweat as fever overtook him. A child playing in the gutter might be laughing in the morning and gasping for breath by the evening. Whole families could vanish within a week, their homes boarded up, their neighbors crossing the street to avoid even looking at their doors. This unpredictability shattered the illusion of safety. Even the healthy felt tainted, as though each step through the city might awaken something lurking in their veins. There are stories of people trying desperately to shield themselves. Some burned bundles of herbs, filling their homes with choking smoke in the belief it cleansed the air. Others carried pomanders, small metal balls filled with spices or perfumes that dangled from belts and released their scent with every step. Physicians in long robes and bird-like masks stuffed with aromatic plants became haunting symbols of this era, wandering the streets like creatures from another world. Their strange appearance terrified children, but their presence reassured adults who longed to believe that bad air could be battled with fragrance. Yet no matter how much incense was burned, no matter how many flowers were carried, the invisible killers still entered homes and claimed their victim, and the sicknesses were not always the same. Some brought high fevers and swollen lumps, others brought violent diarrhea and unbearable thirst, while still others left the skin mottled black or the lungs filled with fluid. Each new outbreak felt like a new kind of curse, an unfamiliar terror that gave people no chance to adapt. The uncertainty made life itself feel unstable. Was it the food from the market, the water from the well, the breeze that swept down from the river? No one could know, and so suspicion spread as quickly as disease. The randomness tore apart communities. People avoided neighbors they had once trusted, fearing that proximity itself was dangerous. Mothers held their children back from playing in the streets. Travelers were turned away from inns, accused of carrying illness in their cloaks. Priests struggled to gather congregations as churches emptied, the faithful too afraid of infection to seek salvation. Society fractured under the weight of paranoia. In many ways, the fear of contagion was as destructive as the diseases themselves, isolating people and shattering bonds that had once held them together. One particularly grim account comes from Florence during the Black Death. Chroniclers described how fathers abandoned sons and husbands abandoned wives, each person consumed by the instinct to survive. Love and loyalty were tested against the terror of invisible sickness, and often terror won. This collapse of trust left deep scars, for even those who survived carried the memory of abandonment, of neighbors turning their backs, of families torn apart not only by death but by fear. And yet, not everyone fled. Some leaned into faith, believing illness was a test from God. They walked boldly through plague-ridden streets, carrying crosses, convinced their devotion made them immune. Others joined processions of flagellants, whipping their own backs in public squares, hoping their suffering would spare them divine punishment. These acts were both terrifying and mesmerizing, displays of desperation in the face of an unseen enemy. But even among the most faithful, illness still struck, proving that no ritual, no prayer, no sacrifice could guarantee safety. The most haunting part of these invisible killers was their silence. Unlike the chaos of war or the noise of fire, sickness crept quietly. It lived in breaths, in sips of water, in bites of bread. People learned to fear the very necessities of life, unsure whether each act of survival might be their undoing. That silence hung heavy in the streets, making every cough, every shiver, every pale face into an omen. And when people finally began to piece together patterns, when they noticed the rats, the fleas, the filth, it was too late. The knowledge was incomplete, the tools to act non-existent. All they could do was endure, generation after generation, knowing that unseen forces would always return. And if the unseen diseases were terrifying in their suddenness, the swarms of visible creatures, the buzzing flies, the writhing worms that accompanied them made the nightmare complete, for they turned every meal and every corner of the city into a reminder that life itself was crawling with death. The flies were the constant companions of urban life, so common that people barely noticed them until their numbers became overwhelming. They hovered in thick black clouds above garbage heaps, swarmed around butcher stalls, and crawled over wounds that never healed. In a world where filth was everywhere, the fly was king, feeding on everything that rotted and carrying it silently from one place to another. To watch a fly land on a piece of bread was to watch disease make itself at home on your dinner table. Yet there was no escaping them. Families swatted, waved their hands, and hung cloths over food, but the flies always returned, relentless and infinite. The danger they carried was invisible but deadly. After landing on dung or carrion, a fly could transfer countless particles of filth to the next surface it touched. People noticed that children who ate uncovered food often fell sick, but they did not understand the chain of cause. To them, flies were pests, not executioners. And so the buzzing continued in kitchens, taverns, and markets, a soundtrack of survival and decay intertwined. Chroniclers describe entire rooms where food seemed alive with their presence, tables shimmering under their constant movement, their wings catching the light like sparks in the gloom. Even worse was the intimacy of flies with the human body. They crawled across lips as people slept, dipped into cups of ale as if invited, and clung to hair and clothing. They feasted openly on wounds, laying eggs in exposed flesh that hatched into wriggling larvae within days. Soldiers returning from battle often carried not only scars, but infestations, maggots eating away at their flesh while comrades recoiled in horror. For ordinary citizens, this was no distant nightmare. It was part of everyday existence. A farmer cutting his foot in the market could easily find it swarmed by flies before he reached home. Infection was inevitable, slow death disguised as a simple bite or cut. Worms and vermin completed the horror. Leftover food, often stored in damp cupboards or clay jars, quickly sprouted life of its own. Bread grew moldy, crawling with unseen spores that filled the air when broken. Meat was soon alive with maggots, writhing and pale, forcing families to choose between hunger and disgust. Even grains, once thought to be safe, were chewed through by beetles and worms, their tiny bodies wriggling among the kernels. To modernize, this is revolting, but for the poor, it was reality. Food spoiled faster than it could be eaten, and hunger made people tolerate the intolerable. Some cut away the worst, boiled what remained, and prayed it would not sicken them. These infestations blurred the boundary between food and filth. A loaf of bread could begin as nourishment, but end as poison. A piece of cheese could hide colonies of insects inside its rind. Chroniclers tell of taverns where patrons drank beer laced with drowned flies, too thirsty to protest. Children sucked on fruits already crawling with larvae, their small bodies less resistant to the diseases that followed. Each meal carried the risk of contamination, but no one had a choice. To refuse was to starve, and starvation was a death even crueler than illness. Flies also shaped the rhythm of daily life. People often ate quickly, not out of impatience, but to keep food out of the insect's reach. Meals were covered with cloth, but flies slipped beneath, drawn by scent alone. In some places, households burned pungent herbs to drive them away, filling rooms with choking smoke. In wealthier homes, servants were tasked with waving branches over tables during banquets, creating a constant dance between luxury and decay. Even in moments of celebration, the buzzing presence of flies reminded everyone that death was never far from the feast. Their presence also fueled superstition. Some believed flies were physical embodiments of demons, drawn to sin and filth. The biblical association of Beelzebub, the lord of the flies, gave weight to this fear. When plagues swept through cities, people claimed to see unusual swarms, black clouds of insects gathering like omens in the sky. They whispered that these creatures were heralds of punishment, visible signs of God's anger. Whether seen as pests or as curses, flies became symbols of contamination, not just of the body, but of the soul. What made them most terrifying, however, was their persistence. You could kill dozens, hundreds even, but more always came. Their eggs hatched in carcasses and garbage and dung piles that multiplied faster than any human hand could clear away. The city was their kingdom, its filth their endless resource. Each attempt to resist them, each swat, each fire lit, each prayer muttered, proved futile against their sheer numbers. They were the unstoppable companions of human existence, whispering reminders with every buzz that decay was stronger than cleanliness, that death was stronger than life. And if the flies ruled the air, the worms ruled the earth below. They wriggled from corpses and shallow graves, spilled onto the streets after rains, and infested the very ground people walked upon. To step into mud was sometimes to feel it alive beneath your feet, the soil shifting with unseen movement. The city was not just covered in filth, it was animated by it, crawling with life that fed on death. For every fly swatted, for every worm crushed, 100 more waited, thriving in silence. This ceaseless crawling presence made survival a test of endurance. People tried to ignore it, to pretend their bread was clean, their water pure, their homes safe. But the buzzing always returned, the worms always reappeared, the infestation never truly ended. And as revolting as it was only part of the larger nightmare. For while flies and worms swarmed visibly around daily life, even more disturbing horrors lay waiting in the city's rituals of death, where the line between the living and the dead blurred in ways that scarred generations. Burial was supposed to bring dignity to death, but in plague-stricken cities, dignity was the first thing to disappear. Cemeteries overflowed within weeks, their walls straining against the weight of countless coffins stacked one upon another. Gravediggers could not keep pace with the tide of bodies. Holes were dug shallow, often just deep enough to cover the surface, and corpses were piled together in layers, lime poured hastily to mask the odor. The earth bulged with the pressure of decay, and when rains came, bones surfaced again, white reminders of the lives that had ended too quickly. What terrified survivors most was how quickly rituals collapsed. In normal times, families would gather around a coffin, prayers would be spoken, candles lit, and loved ones escorted to consecrated ground. During outbreaks, this rhythm shattered. Priests were stretched thin, running from house to house until they themselves fell ill. Many bodies went unblessed, carted off in silence, their names forgotten the moment the earth closed over them. It was not just the loss of life, it was the loss of the sacred passage that was supposed to guide the soul. People whispered in anguish that without proper burial, their dead wandered restless, unable to find peace. The carts themselves became symbols of despair. Men hired to collect corpses shouted through the streets, their wheels rattling over cobblestones as families rushed to drag their loved ones outside. At first, neighbors wept together, clinging to any sense of shared grief. But soon, when the carts passed too often, doors stayed closed. People watched from windows instead, hiding from the stench that followed. Chroniclers tell of carts so full that bodies tumbled off as they turned corners, rolling into gutters where they remained until someone found the courage to drag them back. The very act of transport became grotesque, as if death mocked the living with its abundance. Mass graves were the most haunting of all. Dug hastily outside city walls, they grew into yawning pits, swallowing dozens, then hundreds at a time. Corpses were dumped unceremoniously, limbs tangled, faces pressed together, sometimes without even a shroud. The ground became unstable, sinking under the weight, the smell detectable for miles. In Florence, during the Black Death, a notary wrote of pits so deep and filled that gravediggers had to walk across the bodies to make room for new arrivals. In London, chroniclers described the sight of dogs digging into plague pits, dragging human remains back into the streets. These were not places of rest. They were open wounds on the city, visible scars of its helplessness. Yet even amid this horror, there were stories of defiance. Some families risked infection to bury their loved ones secretly, digging small graves in gardens or courtyards. Others bribed officials to secure a space inside churchyards, even as the ground there turned swampy with decay. These desperate acts show how deeply people yearned to preserve dignity, even when surrounded by indignity. To bury a loved one properly became an act of resistance against chaos, a fragile attempt to maintain humanity when everything else was collapsing. The psychological burden of these hasty burials was immense. Survivors could not visit graves to grieve. There were no markers, no names. Children grew up unable to find where their parents had been laid. Spouses could not kneel by the resting place of their partners. This erasure of memory was perhaps the cruelest cut, for death no longer just ended a life, it erased it. Generations later, people still spoke of the plague pits with dread, as cursed places where souls remained trapped and restless, their cries said to echo at night. The contamination did not end with the burials themselves. When graves overflowed or were dug too shallow, the runoff seeped into wells and water supplies. There are accounts from German cities where residents refused to drink from certain wells because they swore they could taste the grave in the water. Others reported that dogs and pigs, rooting near cemeteries, carried human remains into the streets. The very effort to contain the dead often became another source of disease for the living, binding the two worlds together in a grim circle. Religious leaders struggled to respond. Some declared that the overwhelming numbers were a test from God, that the absence of proper rites was proof of divine wrath. Others tried to reassure the faithful that God's mercy extended beyond hurried burials, but their voices carried little weight against the overwhelming reality of unmarked graves and the smell of decay that clung to entire districts. Faith itself began to buckle under the strain, leaving many to wonder if heaven was even reachable when hell seemed so near at hand. This collapse of ritual and order planted seeds of despair that lasted long after the plague had passed. Survivors carried guilt for abandoning loved ones, for not giving them the dignity they deserved. They remembered the sight of bodies piled in carts, the sound of shovels scraping hastily against soil, the emptiness of graves without names. These memories outlived the outbreaks themselves, shaping the way entire generations thought about life, death, and the fragile boundary between them. And, while burials revealed the breakdown of sacred traditions, another equally shocking element of city life showed how superstition and ignorance shaped survival. For even as people watched death pile up around them, many believed that washing and cleanliness invited sickness rather than prevented it, leading to a paradox where fear of illness pushed them deeper into filth. This belief, as strange as it sounds to us now, only fed the endless cycle of contagion that the city could never escape. Cleanliness should have been a weapon against disease, but in the medieval city it was often seen as a danger. The idea that washing the body could invite sickness was deeply rooted in fear and misunderstanding. Physicians at the time warned that warm water opened the pores, leaving the body exposed to harmful vapors and poisoned air. To bathe was, in their eyes, to lower one's defenses against the unseen killers that lurked in the atmosphere. And so, in an age when disease spread most easily through filth, people avoided water out of terror, trapping themselves in the very conditions that allowed plague to thrive. Bathhouses, once popular in earlier centuries, came to be regarded with suspicion. In some cities, they were closed altogether, not only because of the fear of illness, but also because of the association with immorality. They were places where bodies mingled in steam, where sickness might pass invisibly from one person to another. Chroniclers describe how bathhouses were abandoned during outbreaks, their wooden tubs left dry, their stone chambers echoing with silence. What might have been a refuge of cleansing became instead a symbol of danger. People wrapped themselves in layers of clothing, convinced that thick fabric offered better protection than water ever could. The result was an urban population coated in dirt. Hair went unwashed for months, skin crusted with sweat and grime, clothes stiffened from repeated wear without laundering. The stench of unwashed bodies mixed with the odors of the streets, creating an atmosphere that was both suffocating and infectious. Travelers often remarked that the smell of a crowded inn was unbearable, with dozens of people sleeping close together in air that reeked of sweat, breath, and unwashed flesh. And yet, those very conditions were tolerated because washing was seen as more dangerous than enduring filth. Ironically, in trying to protect themselves, people only deepened their vulnerability. Lice, fleas, and other parasites flourished on unwashed skin and clothing, carrying with them the diseases that terrified the population. Rats thrived in homes where filth accumulated, and fleas found easy homes in bedding never exposed to water or sunlight. The superstition against bathing gave parasites free rein, transforming every household into a nest of infection. Mothers who avoided washing their children out of fear only condemned them to carry the very pests that spread death. There were, of course, exceptions. Some religious orders practiced ritual washing as part of purification, but even this was done with caution, often using cold water and avoiding the belief that it could cleanse disease. Wealthier families sometimes maintained private baths, using herbs and perfumed oils to protect themselves, but these were rare luxuries. For the majority, daily life was defined by the absence of water on the skin, by the heavy scent of unwashed humanity that clung to every street. This fear of bathing was reinforced during outbreaks, when physicians pointed to those who frequented bathhouses as early victims. The logic seemed simple. The sick had washed, therefore washing must weaken the body. No one saw the more obvious connection, that parasites thrived in filth, not cleanliness. The tragedy of this misunderstanding was that the very act that might have offered some relief was demonized, turned into a ritual of risk rather than survival. Superstitions filled the void where science was absent. People wore amulets, carried herbs, and rubbed vinegar on their hands instead of washing. They perfumed their clothes, believing that pleasant odors could shield them from bad air. Incense filled churches, not only as a religious offering, but as a desperate attempt to drive away disease. Every smell became a symbol of safety or threat, and every drop of water became an object of suspicion. In this way, daily life turned into a theater of rituals designed to protect against what people could not see or understand. The psychological effect was profound. To bathe was to court danger, to invite whispers from neighbors, to risk being labeled reckless in a time of fear. Children grew up learning that soap and water were not friends but enemies, that survival depended on avoidance rather than cleansing. This mindset sank so deeply into culture that even centuries later echoes of it remained, shaping attitudes toward hygiene long after the plagues had passed. Yet despite this widespread avoidance, people still longed for relief from the filth. Diaries tell of men sneaking to rivers to wash in secret, of women boiling water late at night to bathe their children quietly, hiding their actions from neighbors. These stolen moments of cleanliness reveal a yearning that superstition could not erase, the human need for purity, for the comfort of feeling clean even in a world where dirt was considered protection. It was a rebellion against fear, a fragile attempt to reclaim some control in a life otherwise ruled by disease. But such acts were rare, and most surrendered to the weight of belief. The unwashed city became a breeding ground, its people clinging to rituals that doomed them further. And while superstition shaped how they cared for their bodies, another kind of terror shaped how they viewed their neighbors. Because illness struck so suddenly, suspicion spread quickly, and entire communities began to look at each other, not as allies in survival, but as threats, carriers, and possible executioners. Panic was the most contagious disease of all. It spread faster than fever, faster than cough, faster than the plague itself. When illness struck a household, fear rippled outward like cracks across glass. Neighbors whispered, doors slammed shut, and people crossed the street rather than risk brushing shoulders with the doomed. In those moments, the greatest enemy was not only the sickness, but the suspicion that poisoned every human bond. Trust, once the fabric that held communities together, tore apart under the weight of invisible threats. Imagine a single cough echoing in a crowded marketplace. Heads would snap around, eyes wide with dread. The merchant who coughed might insist it was nothing more than dust in his throat, but already his stall stood empty. Customers vanished, rumors grew, and soon his family was shunned as though they carried death in their very breath. In cities where survival depended on cooperation, on buying bread, on sharing water, on helping neighbors, this sudden collapse of trust was devastating. Fear isolated people, making them prisoners inside their own homes long before illness even touched them. The paranoia reached into every corner of daily life. Friends avoided handshakes, priests hesitated to give blessings, lovers met in secret but feared that even a kiss might carry the end. Mothers pulled children away from playmates, scolding them not for disobedience but for risking their lives. Every glance carried suspicion, every touch carried danger. To live in the city was to feel surrounded not only by filth and sickness, but by eyes watching for the first sign of weakness. Chroniclers recorded chilling examples of this suspicion turning into cruelty. In Florence, entire houses were locked from the outside by fearful neighbors, trapping sick families inside to die alone. In London, women accused of bringing illness into communities were beaten or driven away, their pleas drowned out by mobs desperate to protect themselves. Rumors of intentional poisoning spread quickly. Strangers were blamed, foreigners accused, and sometimes entire groups like Jews or travelers were targeted in waves of violence. Fear distorted reason, turning suffering communities into hunting grounds for scapegoats. But suspicion did not always need an enemy outside. Families themselves fractured under its weight. Fathers fled from infected households, abandoning wives and children to save themselves. Brothers refused to share food, fearing it had been touched by disease. Even marriages broke apart when one spouse showed symptoms, the healthy one choosing solitude over loyalty. Chroniclers of the Black Death wrote with bitterness about how love itself seemed to vanish, replaced by the instinct to survive at any cost. And yet, the same records also speak of those who stayed, who chose to face death together rather than surrender to fear. These rare stories of devotion stand out like flickers of light in a world consumed by darkness. The city itself amplified the paranoia. Narrow streets and overcrowded homes meant that news of sickness traveled instantly. A single marked door, painted with ash or chalk to warn others of illness inside, cast a shadow over an entire street. People walked quickly past, whispering prayers, holding their breath, as though the very air outside the home might be contaminated. Markets emptied, taverns went silent, and even churches thinned as the faithful struggled to balance their need for salvation against their fear of gathering with the sick. Superstition only deepened the terror. Some believed that witches spread disease through curses, others that neighbors brewed poisons in their kitchens. Strange smells, unusual clouds, even the behavior of animals became reasons for suspicion. A crow circling above a house, a cat lying too long on a doorstep. These were seen as omens of sickness within. When people could not understand the true nature of contagion, they filled the void with imagination, and imagination was often more terrifying than reality. The psychological scars ran deep. Children grew up associating neighbors not with comfort, but with danger. They learned to fear strangers, to distrust kindness, to believe that survival meant turning away rather than reaching out. This erosion of community left wounds that lasted long after outbreaks faded. Even when markets reopened and families reunited, the memory of betrayal lingered. People remembered the doors that had stayed closed when they begged for help, the faces that had turned away when they needed water or bread. And yet, out of this suspicion, new forms of control emerged. Authorities began marking sick households, enforcing quarantines, and patrolling streets to prevent gatherings. These measures gave the illusion of order, but they also fueled resentment. To be marked was not only to be sick, it was to be branded, to be cast out from society even before death arrived. Quarantine became a sentence of isolation, where families waited not only for illness, but for starvation and despair. The city turned into a map of invisible boundaries, with every street a potential prison and every neighbor a potential jailer. Suspicion, once seated, never fully disappeared. It lingered even in times of calm, shaping how people approached one another, how they trusted, how they loved. It created a culture of caution, a constant readiness for betrayal. And while fear of neighbors fractured communities, another terror loomed just as large. The sudden, uncontrollable outbursts of plague that swept through streets like fire, turning entire districts into cemeteries overnight, reminding everyone that no wall of suspicion could hold back the flood of death when it chose to return. Authorities were supposed to protect their people, but in the medieval city, power often meant indifference. When plagues struck, leaders disappeared behind palace walls, leaving the poor to fend for themselves. City councils argued over who should pay for clean water or waste removal, while the streets outside filled with rotting garbage and uncollected corpses. Taxes were collected without pause. Soldiers still patrolled for order, but when citizens begged for help, officials turned their faces away. The message was clear. Survival was not a collective responsibility, but an individual struggle, and those without wealth or power were left to drown in the filth of their own neighborhoods. The failure was not just inaction, but often exploitation. In times of crisis, many rulers saw opportunity. Special levies were introduced to fund health measures, but the money vanished into private pockets. Food prices skyrocketed, manipulated by merchants with close ties to city officials. Families starving in the shadow of plague pits were forced to sell their last possessions for a loaf of bread, while council members dined in safety on meat and wine. This corruption was noticed and remembered, carving deep resentment into the memory of the people who saw in every epidemic not only divine punishment but human betrayal. One striking example comes from Milan, where officials famously walled up entire households suspected of plague, sealing the sick and the healthy alike inside their homes until all were dead. This was not protection, it was extermination disguised as policy. Elsewhere, leaders ordered quarantines that trapped families without food or clean water, guaranteeing that disease was not their only killer. In cities like Marseille and Lubeck, patrols enforced curfews with violence, beating those who dared to leave their homes even in search of survival. The law became another plague, and obedience became as deadly as illness. The clergy, too, often failed their flock. While some priests risked their lives to offer last rites, many others fled at the first sign of danger. Monasteries closed their gates, bishops retreated to rural estates, and the poor were left without spiritual guidance in their darkest hour. Faith, which should have been a refuge, often felt like abandonment. People saw empty pulpits and silent bells and wondered if God himself had turned away. Yet in this void, new religious movements emerged. Flagellants parading through the streets, prophets preaching repentance, and doomsayers claiming the end of the world had arrived. When official voices fell silent, desperate ones rose to fill the air. The neglect of public health was especially devastating. Sewers clogged with waste, wells contaminated with corpses, and markets swarming with flies went unaddressed because officials deemed the problems too expensive or too politically risky. The elite could flee to country estates where air was cleaner, but the poor had no escape. Cities became prisons of contagion, where the very structures meant to protect, the walls, the gates, the markets, turned into traps. The city was supposed to represent civilization, but in these moments, it revealed itself as a machine of suffering. Even when measures were taken, they were often guided more by superstition than science. Fires were lit in public squares to purify the air, filling neighborhoods with choking smoke. Gunpowder and sulfur were burned in houses believed to be infected, suffocating families inside. Cats and dogs were slaughtered en masse, accused of carrying disease, while the real culprits, rats and fleas, multiplied unchecked. These misguided actions not only failed to stop the plague, but sometimes worsened it, destroying the animals that might have kept vermin at bay. Leadership was not just absent, it was dangerously wrong. The people did not forget. When outbreaks subsided, rebellions often flared, fueled by anger at officials who had abandoned them. Chroniclers speak of riots in cities where survivors attacked government buildings, looted the homes of the wealthy, and demanded justice for their dead. In some cases, entire councils were overthrown, their members executed as symbols of greed and failure. Epidemics did not only kill bodies, they corroded authority, leaving scars in the political fabric that lasted for generations. Yet the failures of government were not just structural, they were personal. Survivors remembered the faces of tax collectors who demanded payment as their families starved, the guards who struck them down when they searched for food, the priests who closed church doors against them. Memory turned into legend, and legend into mistrust that shaped how future generations saw authority itself. Even long after the plague had passed, the shadow of betrayal lingered, teaching people that in times of crisis, help would not come from above. This deep mistrust left communities fractured. Without guidance or protection, people turned inward, clinging only to family or small circles of neighbors. The bonds of civic duty frayed, replaced by suspicion and resentment. The city, which should have been a fortress against chaos, became instead a stage where corruption and negligence made the horrors of disease even more unbearable. And yet, despite the failures of leaders, despite the silence of priests and the corruption of councils, people endured. They adapted, they survived, and they rebuilt. But in their resilience was also resignation, a haunting acceptance that plague and betrayal were part of the rhythm of life. And it was this acceptance, the normalization of despair, that paved the way for the most chilling truth of all, that over time, people stopped seeing these horrors as extraordinary. They became ordinary, woven into the very idea of living in a city, as natural as breathing the foul air that hung above the streets. The most disturbing reality of life in the medieval city was not just the filth, the stench, or the endless cycles of disease. It was how ordinary all of it became. What horrifies us now was, for them, the background of daily existence. People woke each morning not surprised to see dead animals in the streets, not shocked to hear the cries of death carts echoing through alleys, but resigned, as though such things were no more unusual than the tolling of the church bell. The constant presence of decay shaped how people thought, how they loved, and even how they prayed. Misery became so common that it no longer seemed like tragedy. It was life. Children grew up in this world of rot and never questioned it. They played in alleys where puddles shimmered with human waste, chasing rats as if they were toys rather than plague carriers. A dead horse swelling in the sun was not an aberration, but a landmark to climb upon or circle around. They learned early that every cough could be fatal, that every trip to the market could bring sickness home. Yet they laughed, sang, and lived, their innocence built not on ignorance but on familiarity. Fear dulled when it was constant, and for a generation raised among corpses and filth, horror was nothing more than the ordinary rhythm of the city. Adults, too, learned to adapt by turning numbness into survival. A butcher might step over a carcass on his way to work without sparing a glance. A housewife sweeping her doorway might ignore the stench drifting from the gutter, focusing instead on the bread she had to bake. A priest might mutter a hurried blessing over a corpse in the street before moving on to his next duty. Each act was not indifference, but necessity. To stop, to truly feel the weight of what surrounded them, would have been unbearable. So they accepted, and in acceptance, the extraordinary became mundane. This normalization was dangerous because it robbed people of urgency. Outbreaks of plague no longer shocked them into reform, but were treated like storms, inevitable, destructive, and temporary. When the bodies piled high and the bells rang without pause, people grieved. But when the numbers lessened, they returned to life as before, as if nothing had happened. The filth remained, the rats still thrived, the wells stayed poisoned, but no great changes followed. Each generation seemed willing to endure, hoping that survival itself was enough. Progress stalled beneath the weight of resignation. Yet even within this numbness, fear still lurked in shadows. People might pretend not to notice the buzzing of flies around their food, but in the quiet hours of the night, the unease returned. Parents listened to the coughing of their children with dread, praying that it was not the beginning of something worse. Neighbors avoided eye contact when passing a marked house, ashamed of their relief that it was someone else's family and not their own. The acceptance of horror did not erase its power. It only buried it under layers of silence and denial. The culture of resignation seeped into art and religion. Paintings and sermons alike reminded the people that life was fleeting, that death was a constant companion. Skeletons danced across murals in churches, grim reminders that no one could escape the fate of the pit. Priests preached about the vanity of earthly life, urging their flock to embrace suffering as preparation for eternity. Death was not hidden. It was celebrated, ritualized, woven into the very symbols that decorated public spaces. The city itself became a stage where life and death played side by side, inseparable and eternal. But resignation also created strange forms of resilience. Because death was always near, people learned to cling fiercely to small joys. A wedding celebrated in a plague year carried more meaning, because everyone knew how fragile happiness was. A feast held in a foul-smelling tavern still filled with laughter, because laughter itself was defiance. Survivors told stories of endurance, of how they outlasted the sickness, of how their families rebuilt from nothing. The normalization of horror may have dulled outrage, but it also forged a hard kind of strength, the ability to keep going even when surrounded by decay. Still, this strength came with a cost. Generations raised in such conditions carried scars that never healed. Trust eroded, faith weakened, and love often gave way to caution. People learned not to hope too much, not to dream too far ahead, because the next outbreak could take everything away. The city was not a place of promise, but of endurance, a landscape where the greatest achievement was simply to survive another season. This mentality shaped the very soul of urban life, creating a culture that lived in the present because the future was too uncertain to believe in. And yet, beneath the surface of acceptance, there was always a question that haunted the people of those centuries. If this was normal, if this was life, then what did it say about the world itself? Was it cursed beyond redemption? Was God punishing them endlessly for sins they could never atone for? Or was this simply the nature of existence, that filth, decay, and death were not accidents, but the foundation on which cities were built? These questions whispered through taverns, echoed in sermons, and lingered in the silence of empty streets. The normalization of despair was perhaps the most terrifying legacy of all, because it ensured that nothing changed. People endured filth instead of fighting it, tolerated plague instead of preventing it, accepted suffering instead of demanding more. And while they lived and died in this endless cycle, they carried the weight of knowing that it would never truly end, that the horrors of the city were not temporary storms, but permanent features of their world. And when one horror became ordinary, it left the door wide open for the next to feel inevitable, ensuring that death would always remain the truest citizen of the city.